Okay, so back when I was in the military, I was based out in California. This was pretty much right at the start of the housing bust, and I found myself newly divorced following a deployment. As such, I could no longer live on base and had to move. I quickly discovered that it was the same price or cheaper to rent a house instead of an apartment off base, so I got in touch with a realtor who worked with residents of a local gated community. As a newly single female with zero family in the area, I thought extra security could only be a good thing. I soon found the perfect house. It was amazing. Had a wrap around the porch with a view of the lake in the center of the community, had trees block my view of my neighbors, an awesome kitchen, I love cooking, and tons of local wildlife. I could easily see myself recovering from what had been an ungodly rough year. The owner mostly lived overseas, so I never really dealt with him, except when I moved in, but he seemed very nice, if a bit particular. He obviously loved the house, so I didn't think much of that. The 2 times I needed something looked after, his brother came to deal with them, as he was a handyman of sorts. I always found it a bit weird that him and his brother looked like they could have been twins, to the point where I thought his brother was him when he came to pick up the dryer when it needed fixing. Literally, he picked it up and carried it out in his arms. Funny thing about PTSD brain though, is that lots of normal things seem weird while strange things seem normal. So I never really thought of the landlord-brother situation as odd until after. Maybe it was normal, and the whole oddness of what happened is setting off my paranoia. I don't really know, but yeah, landlord odd. Brother was apparently the Hulk. Both spoke to me like I was their kid who needed very strict instructions. Anyway, I enjoyed my time in the house. My emotional support animal puppy loved it too because the next door neighbors had dogs for her to play with. But my PTSD and other mental health issues had me on a path headed straight for a medical separation. But then the president issued a series of rollback programs. A chance for military members to separate ahead of contract in anticipation for the Middle Eastern conflict to be abandoned. My commander highly suggested, if you're military, you know this basically means do this or else, for me to take the early separation. There were a few reasons surrounding this, but the main was that the squadron knew that they were the reason I was mentally fracked up. And there were more than a few people who had it in for me still at the clinic I was assigned to. Those people kept writing me up for things no one else got written up for. Examples of this: accidentally jamming the shredder that jammed at least once a week, leaving the front desk unattended while I was having an anaphylactic attack, having a panic attack which left work unattended because I was literally curled into a ball in the corner. You get the picture. Of course, my brain took most of the stuff at face value and figured it was okay. I deserved it. But my commander was trying to protect me as best she could and get me out of a clearly hostile work environment ASAP. So I applied and was approved for separation. Now this meant I was leaving my lease before the year was out. I forget if my landlord just decided to be nice, or if I had to pull out a law about military members being entitled to early release from a lease when their duty assignments changed. Probably the second one because he wasn't happy. I didn't really have the mental capability to care too much about putting him out though, because my scrambled brains all of a sudden had a lot of military paperwork and processing to deal with. Not to mention the fact that the whole idea that I was separating felt very surreal in the first place. I'd always thought I'd be a lifer. I didn't tell anyone of my neighbors I was moving out. Only one of my friends knew when exactly I was moving out. And even my movers didn't know exactly when because I stayed there on an air mattress for about a week after they picked up my things. I was camping my way across country on my way home, so I had a lot of stuff to move in my car too. To the best of my knowledge, no one on the base knew exactly when my house would be vacant either, because I'd actually stayed in a motel off base for a few days after I moved out, just to make the final days of last-minute paperwork easier. The house was about 40 minutes from my base, while the motel was 10. They knew what my travel plans. I was on separation leave for that time, which meant I was still technically in the military, and they needed to know exactly where I was, but I had marked my starting location for my trip as my base, not the house. What you should be getting out of this is that only 2 people for sure knew exact date I was leaving the house, my friend and my landlord. He likely told his brother and his realtor as well, but I'm not sure. That said, even my landlord didn't know the exact date I'd be leaving the area, just when I'd vacate the premises. My landlord had told me to drop my house keys in the realtor's mailbox, so that's what I did. And a few days later, I left on my road trip home. Now, about a day later, I got a phone call from my landlord. I'm on the road with my pup, and when I answer, the conversation follows. "Hey, you left your camera here." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, it's a Nikon with a nice set of lenses and camera bag." "Oh, I don't have one of those." "Really? My brother said you did." I tried to think back, and I remember his brother coming over to drop off, again literally with his arms, the dryer when my sister and nephew were in town. She's an avid photographer, and I figured she must have had the camera bag out in preparation for the day trip to San Francisco. "No, I only had those Canons that fit in your pocket. You must be thinking of my sister's, but she for sure brought that home with her months ago." Landlord is silent for a while before, "Well, what about this sleeping bag that's here?" "No, I definitely have my sleeping bag." Landlord again describes my sleeping bag exactly. "No, I have mine. I slept in it last night. I stayed at a KOA campsite." Landlord again, quiet before answering. "There's a backpack too, with a few random items." His tone changed to accusation. "Do you tell one of my friends you could stay here for the rest of your lease?" "No! Only one of my friends knows exactly when I moved out, and he's visiting his wife who is deployed in Korea right now." "Well, someone's been living here." At this point, it should have occurred to me how weird it was that he'd gone from friendly, "Hey, you forgot this," to angry, "You let someone squat here," so quickly. But it was only just getting through my head that someone had clearly moved in the moment I moved out. This house didn't have an attic, so it couldn't have been one of those, someone was living in the attic while I was living there and moved down into the main house later situations. There wasn't a sealed off part of the house where this could have been done, and even went into the basement on a regular basis. It's possible someone was living in the woods behind the house, but I have no idea. Anyway, my landlord wanted me to come over and check the stuff to make sure it wasn't mine. I told him that I'd finished up my paperwork, so I was on the road and already in Oregon. He clearly hadn't expected me to have already left the area since I still had a few days on my lease. Yes, it should have struck me weird he was already in the house, but I figured he'd pick up the keys and knew I was out. I told him he'd have to call me back after he figured things out. He never called back. I texted him later to follow up, but all I got was a short no response to my questions. No, they don't know whose stuff it was. No answer when I told him I was freaked out and wanted to know what had happened. Yes, he'd gotten both set of keys from the realtor. No, he hadn't found anything else. Not long after, I got full deposit back, which hadn't been expected since I felt bad for not staying my whole lease. I hadn't planned on asking for it. It wasn't until relaying this all to my mom later that I realized exactly how weird the whole thing was, or that my landlord might have been making up the squatter. She pointed out how strange it was that the guy who was supposedly traveling too much to use his own house would show up himself to walk through the house after I left. But before he picked up the keys or the lease was up, especially since his brother did everything while I lived there, neither of us really sure if he was up to something or if there really had been some extremely creepy stalker/squatter situation. Either way, the whole thing seriously messed with my already messed up head. So let me start this off with a little bit of background information. I was around 16 at the time of this encounter. My house is in a somewhat secluded area and sits in a good bit away from the road, with trees and thick foliage on all sides of the property. It was about mid-June and the trees were packed with heavy green leaves. I had spent most of the day relaxing at home, trying to escape the blistering heat by hiding in my comfy, air-conditioned house. It was on days like this that I really missed having a pool. Being rather bored, I decided to help the time pass by playing some games with some friends online. After shooting the shit for a few hours, the sun was on its way down, and I decided that I should probably shut it off and make my way downstairs to check on dinner. By the time I had made it downstairs, my mother was just beginning to set the table. I helped her with the prep, and we sit down to eat. When I looked up from the freshly cleared plate, the sun had finally set, and once again, night crept in. Not ready to relax for the rest of the night, we cleaned the table and sat down for the movie night. But relaxation was shortcut by the familiar sound of my dogs barking and whining to be let out. I hurriedly jumped from the couch and made my way to the front door. Flicking on the switch under the porch lights, I grabbed the door handle, the cool metal in my hand being a much welcome sensation on that blistering summer night. Turning the handle and swinging the door open, I stepped out into the heavy night air. As my dogs tore past me, flying out into my dimly lit driveway before disappearing from sight, the cicadas buzzed their familiar song as I checked the patio chair for any creepy crawlies, before plopping down and waited for my dogs. After a few minutes, they came floundering back, stumbling over each other, as they pulled and tugged at one another in a gleeful, jovial manner. I stood from my seat and opened the door for my foolish little posse, counting each little ball of fur to make sure that they had all indeed come back, when I noticed that I was missing my little black Shih Tzu. Closing the door to make sure that the dogs didn't get back out, I turned and began to make my way towards my driveway, cupping my hands and bringing them to my mouth in order to amplify my voice. I opened my mouth to call his name, but before I can get any words out, the sound of a woman's voice stopped me. Faint at first, but slowly growing louder. I focused on her words. "Here, puppy. Come here, puppy. Don't be scared. I won't hurt you." My blood ran cold as the sudden realization set in someone that wasn't my family was on my property in the middle of the night. I rushed back to the front door, flinging it open, screaming out to my mother, "There's somebody outside. Get out here now." Not wanting this person to have a chance to snatch my dog, I slammed the door shut and ran blindly into the dark, shouting my dog's name in a desperate attempt to get him to come back to me, before I suddenly tripped on something beneath my feet, slamming hard onto the concrete. As I rolled from my stomach onto my back, I quickly sat up and shoved out my hands in front of me, plunging them into the darkness. I felt the soft coat of my dog, realizing I had tripped on him. I scooped him up and stood on my feet, clutching him close to my chest. I began to desperately try to see through the dark, trying my hardest to find whoever was on my property. Suddenly, the dark was illuminated by the beam of a flashlight. As my mother made her way towards me, "Where are they?" she asked as she flung the flashlight wildly from side to side. I don't know. I heard it over there by the fish pond." My voice left my lips shaken, the adrenaline proving to be too much for my body to handle. My mother now focused the beam on the fish pond, scanning the surrounding area, looking for any movement, but nothing. She now stood beside me as we collectively began to make our way towards the top of the driveway. At first, nothing, but then suddenly out of the corner of my eye, I saw something white being barely illuminated by the outer beam of the flashlight. "There, right there!" I frantically shouted, jerking my finger in the direction of the figure. Where? My mother's words leaving her mouth, heavily drenched in confusion. "Right fucking there!" Adrenaline now fully dictating my demeanor. I snatched light from her hand and shoved it in the direction of the figure, just in time to catch the back of a woman in a white dress make her way through the underbrush before being swallowed by the thick foliage, completely disappearing from sight. "What's over that way?" my mother asked, trying to mask the discomfort in her voice. "The neighbor's house is through there, but that definitely was not one of our neighbors." At this point, my knees were wobbling, threatening to give out at me at any moment. I turned to face my mother, waiting for her to say something.
"Let's get in the house and lock the door. We need to call the police." Hearing my mother suggest to call the cops was a surreal sensation, one that did not help bring any comfort to the situation. Not wanting to be out in the dark with whomever this woman was in white, we rushed back into the house, slamming the door and locking it behind us. Even at 16, I was a fairly big kid, standing at around 6'2" and playing football for my high school, but something about this woman was enough to send shivers down my spine. My mother grabbed the phone and rang the police, as I checked over our little dog to make sure that he wasn't hurt. After a lengthy back and forth with the police, they told us without this person being present on a property, there's nothing they can do. But if she shows up again, we shouldn't hesitate to call them back. After my mother ended the call, she proceeded to call all of their close friends and family and break down what had just happened to us. After a long night of repeating the story over and over to friends and family, we finally decided to call it a night. Making sure that all the doors were locked upstairs and downstairs, we headed to bed. I made sure that night to close my blackout curtains, in fear of walking to see this woman in white dress standing outside my window. Having things similar to this happen before, it was becoming thrilling. The next day, we headed out to our local Home Depot, bought a few motion floodlights, as well as a few no trespassing signs. Unfortunately, this didn't solve the issue, and we would have to go to have many more disturbing encounters with trespassers. As for the woman in white, she never came back. At least not that I'm aware of. The only theory I have is that she was just some crazy lady on drugs, as unfortunately our area tends to have a high drug activity, especially where meth is concerned. I just don't understand why she would have wound up on a property, or why our property seems to draw in so many crazies. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. As for the woman in white, thank you for failing to steal my dog, and then never coming back. For the love of God, let's not meet. Hopefully this format's correct since I'm on mobile. I was told this would be the best place to post my experience, so apologies if not. These experiences took away 1 year after high school, and that was a while ago, so some memories are fuzzy. I, 18 female, was still living at home with my dad. I paid rent and worked full-time at a grocery store. My stalker, let's call him Dave, 18 male, was my emotionally abusive boyfriend at the time. He would constantly state how embarrassed he was of my looks and weight, and then flip the narrative and say how miserable he'd be if I left him. He would try to pressure me to cut ties with my family, and would pout when I declined. I was no shrieking violet, and eventually grew tired of the emotional manipulation. First experience happened while my dad was asleep for his night shift. Dave was at my house trying to pick a fight with me about not moving in with him. Something about the day woke up and I told him, I'm not doing this anymore. We're not good for each other and I want to be happy. Dave lost it. He started crying, and when he realized it wouldn't work, he kept trying to persuade me to stay with him. I told him no, and that we could remain friends. Wrong thing to say. And that he needed to leave. He left, or so I thought. 30 minutes later, I was making pancakes in the kitchen, and I heard my brother's dog, Paco, growling from under the porch. It was a deep growl, and I could tell something was off. I opened the door and found Dave hiding on the corner of the porch. He then bulldozed himself back into the house and told me he would refuse to leave until I was back with him. I began to panic. I didn't want to wake up my dad because I thought I could handle the situation by myself. I wasn't easily intimidated by men and was raised by a bunch of rowdy farmers. I told them I needed to use the bathroom, grabbed my phone, and speed walked into the bathroom and texted one of my guy friends, let's call him Chris, and explained that I needed help. Thank God for Chris. He then dropped everything and drove over as fast as he could while I was stuck in the living room with Dave telling me we'll be moving in together. It was like nothing I said mattered. Chris walked in and told him to leave now or he'll be calling the police. Dave was cowering and booked it. Said he'd text me later. Second experience. This happened a week or so after I broke up with Dave, the stalker. I was on my way to work when I noticed my neighbor's car was following me all the way into town. I lived in a rural area, so it takes a good 30 minutes to go into town. Once I parked, my neighbor, let's call her Sally, parked her car and started waving her hands and yelling. I walked over to her, clearly confused. Maybe something was wrong with her car. She ran over and said, "That green truck has been following you." She pointed across the parking lot, and sure enough, there was Dave in his pickup. Sally began to tell me she had saw the truck parked by my house, out of the view of the main road, and she noticed he'd leave when I left. Sally said she had seen it happen about 3 times, and she wanted me to know. She told me to call the police and hugged me and began yelling obscenities at Dave to leave me alone. I was shaking and thanked her and went in to clock in for my shift. I came out for my first break hours later and noticed he was still parked. I wasn't scared, no. I was furious. I did one of the dumbest things one can do in this situation. I stomped over to his truck and pulled his door open and began yelling at him to leave me alone. And if he doesn't, I'll kick his ass. Dave laughed. Some backstory. I'm a tall Amazonian of a woman and have been known to have a nastier scrapple when it comes to fighting. No matter how intimidating or angry I was, nothing I said was getting through to him. When he laughed, that's when the hairs on my neck stood up. I left his pickup and went back to work. I explained to a coworker what was going on, and he helped me to my car once my shift was over. Dave continued to stalk me for 3 more months, and I kept myself surrounded with friends and my taser. I eventually came out and told my dad. He was upset. I didn't tell him earlier, and he tightened security around the house as a result. I never did call the cops. Dave's stepdad was in the forest, and being in a small town, that gave Dave more leverage to go about with no consequences. I was finally able to shake him from stalking me when I got a new boyfriend, now husband, and that's a whole other story. My neighbor and friends were very helpful in knowing what I now know. If I wasn't warned by my neighbor or my friend decided not to answer my text, I probably would have been in a whole different situation. Maybe I'll share more encounters of Dave the stalker in another post.
You know that uneasy, disturbing feeling you get when you sit on the toilet and it's warm because somebody else sat on it shortly before you? Yeah, I hate that feeling. The thing that makes it even more disturbing for me, though, is the fact that I live alone. It started about a week ago. I was outside on my front porch watching hummingbirds buzz around my olive tree and eating a bowl of ice cream. I love ice cream so much. Sadly, it does not love me back. Before long, I needed to go to the bathroom so bad, I was afraid I was going to brown my pants. I hurriedly threw my spoon, bouncing it off the side of the bowl and spraying ice cream soup onto the patio as I took off running inside and towards the bathroom. Before my cheeks even touched the seat, I was laying waste to the bowl. However, the moment I hit the seat, I froze. It was warm, as if somebody had just been sitting there. My gaze quickly leapt from corner to corner of the room, making a mental check of where everything should have been. Toothbrush on the right side of the sink, check. Yesterday's clothes laying on the floor by the door, check. Dirty clothes hamper on the other side of the room, closed, check. Having found nothing else out of the ordinary, I finished my business and assumed it was just my imagination before washing my hands. Although, as I went to wash my hands, I noticed the bottom of the sink was slightly wet. Not wanting to freak myself out further, I just assumed that the sink probably just had a slow drip, washed my hands, and left the bathroom. The rest of the day was uneventful, other than an unwanted call from my ex's friend Annie. I could not stand that pain in the rear. She had called to complain about me butt dialing her the night before at 3 a.m., which, honestly, I didn't know how that was possible, as I had passed out drunk on the couch by midnight. As I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth, I couldn't shake the earlier occurrence out of my head, so I brushed as quickly as I could and set the toothbrush on the right side of the sink before heading to bed. The next morning, I awoke refreshed and ready to start the day. I got up and threw some clothes on and went to the bathroom to brush my teeth. As I reached my right hand down to pick up my toothbrush, I realized something was wrong. The brush was on the left side of the sink, not the right, and again the sink was slightly wet on the bottom. Had I gotten up and brushed my teeth in my sleep? I thought to myself as I ran my tongue across my teeth. No, I definitely had not brushed my teeth, I realized, as I felt the fuzzy buildup on my molars. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I ran to the phone and started to dial 911 before asking myself, what am I going to tell the police? My toothbrush was on the wrong side of the sink this morning? I would just sound like a moron, and they wouldn't believe me. Not being a gun owner, I walked to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife that I own before searching the house. I walked slowly from room to room, checking every cabinet, under every bed, every nook and cranny that I could find. However, I couldn't find a thing. Not a single thing out of place, not a single cabinet cracked open. Nothing. I must be going crazy, I thought to myself. I then went to work, obviously now running late after having my freak out in the morning. I spent the rest of the day at work dwelling on the situation, going over everything in my mind, trying to remember where every item in my house is, so I could tell if anything was different when I got home. Upon getting home, I hesitated before opening the front door, afraid of what I might find on the other side waiting for me. As I walked in, I was greeted by a completely normal-looking entranceway. Nothing out of place. I did a quick run through the house and couldn't find anything had changed since the morning. Relieved, I sat down on the couch and turned on my TV. As I turned on the TV, I noticed it was on AMC. I couldn't help but question myself. Did I watch AMC last time I watched TV? Before chuckling to myself and thinking, man, I must be going crazy if I'm suspicious of even the TV. Before long, I started hearing a disturbingly loud rumble coming from my stomach. Remembering I had not even taken the time to eat breakfast this morning, I headed to the kitchen to get some leftovers out of the fridge. I opened the fridge and began to browse through the contents, looking for the leftover hamburger helper that I knew I should have from the other night. I could not find it anywhere. Discouraged, I closed the door and walked over to the pantry, removing a bag of popcorn. As I was putting the popcorn into the microwave, I noticed something odd. There was a Tupperware dish and fork sitting in the sink to the right of the microwave. Along the bottom of the Tupperware dish and sink were small traces of discarded hamburger meat and bits of noodles. At this point, I knew beyond a doubt that this wasn't my imagination, and I needed to do something. I once again debated calling the cops, but what would I tell them? I still had nothing tangible that would make them take me serious. Remembering the horror movies and stories I grew up watching, I decided to do the one thing that characters rarely do: buy a video camera. I then grabbed a piece of bread out of the bag on the counter and headed to the store. After purchasing the camera and picking up a few groceries, I headed back home. Upon walking into the house, I hurriedly opened up the box and removed the camera. Without even reading the instructions, I excitedly reached for the power button, knowing that soon this would all be over. Nothing. Nothing. The camera would not turn on. Frustrated, I reached for the quick setup guide and opened it up. Step 1. Charge the camera. I immediately put my hand on my forehead and began to laugh at my stupidity. Of course, the camera needs to be charged before you can turn it on. I gathered up the charger, a cable, and plugged it into one of the open outlets in the living room for it to charge overnight. That night, I slept like a baby, knowing that the following day, I would have the capability to getting to the bottom of this mystery. Upon waking up, I walked into the living room, hearing a strange sound coming from my computer. I immediately felt all the blood run out of my face as I watched a video repeating on my computer screen. It was a video of me sleeping. As my eyes dropped in disbelief, another wave of terror ran through me as I read, "Nice try," written on a piece of paper on the keyboard. I am not even ashamed to admit I immediately ran out of the house and straight to my neighbor's house wearing nothing but my boxers. I think any sane person would have done the same thing under the circumstances. I did, however, freak out poor Mrs. Wilson. So much so, she frantically called the police, reporting that her crazed neighbor was pounding on her front door, shouting and wearing nothing but his boxers. Needless to say, that was an interesting conversation with the police, and I profusely apologized for scaring Mrs. Wilson. After telling the police my story, explaining the things being moved, the video and the note, they went in and searched my house. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl as I waited for the officers to find whoever was invading my privacy and taping me while I slept. And after what seemed like an eternity, the police came out of the house, mightily chuckling to themselves. They informed me there was no video playing on the computer, and no note. They asked me if I could go inside with them and show them the camera, to see if the video was still on the camera. As I walked into the living room with the officers, my heart sank as I saw the empty outlet where the camera had been charging. The camera and the charger were both gone. I shakingly explained to the officers that the camera was plugged in right there. They dismissively told me that if I noticed anything else strange to let them know, and for me to go get dressed and try to get some sleep. At this point, I wanted nothing more than to go and get a hotel somewhere else and not stay another night in my house. However, I am not made of money and I cannot afford a hotel. Therefore, I decided to do the next best thing and I slept in my car. I wanted to be able to keep an eye on my house, so if I saw lights turn on during the night, I could get the police to come by and show them that I'm not crazy. I, however, did not see any lights or movement around the house that night. Finally, tonight, after 3 days of sleeping in my car and not seeing anything odd happening in the house, I decided to move back in, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the person had left as to not get caught by the police and would not return. I did, however, sleep in the bedroom, with the door shut and locked, and a steak knife hidden in between the mattress and the bed frame. I woke to a loud bang of a door slamming shut. Immediately, I called the police and reported that somebody was in my house. I could hear them walking through the living room, into the kitchen, and rummaging through my fridge. The operator instructed me to hide in the bedroom closet until the police arrived. I grabbed my knife and huddled in the corner of my closet behind some clothes. After what seemed like an hour, I heard 2 officers shouting for whoever was out there to put their hands on the wall. This was followed by crying and incoherent shouting from a woman. A few minutes later, I heard my front door slam shut. I hesitantly walked to the bedroom door and opened it slowly, knife in hand. As I walked into the living room, I was greeted by a bright light shining in my eyes and an officer shouting at me to put my weapon down as he pointed his gun at my chest. I slowly put my knife down on the table next to the door and proceeded to tell the officer my name and that I was the home owner. He led me outside to meet the other officer who was putting the woman in his squad car. After examining my ID, the officer showed me a copy of my front door key that she had somehow made. He then explained that the woman claimed I had given her the key and allowed her to come and stay at my house so she would not have to sleep on the street. I, of course, assured the officer that I had not granted her permission and most certainly had not given her a key to my house. After filling out my report with the officer, they left with the woman in the back of the squad car. Now, I'm here at my computer, unable to sleep from the night's, no, weeks' events. Emotional and physically exhausted. I guess I should feel safer now that I know that the woman has been terrorizing me is gone. However, I can't seem to shake the feeling that something is wrong. Have I just gotten so used to expecting the worst that now that it's finally over, I'm looking for something to be out of place? Now, as I stare at the empty table next to the bedroom door, where I put my knife, I can't remember. Did the officer take my knife?
Hey guys, I want to thank you so much for watching the video. I'm a little sick right now, so my voice sounds like mega doo-doo. I also want to thank Quipster Punk for joining me today. This was his original story he wrote and narrated. I also just released some merch over on Spreadshirt.com. I'll put a link in the description field if you're interested in that. And as always, I want to thank you so much for being here. And that's about it. If you guys can comment down below a story or a type of subject you'd like to hear next, I'd greatly appreciate it. I will be taking a break this next week because I have some training to do for work, and that'll pretty much occupy all my time. I'm going to try my best to secure some more stories, and if you guys have any of your own horror stories, you can submit them to OriginalGenSen at gmail.com and just put the subject as my horror story or something of the means. And I'll be sure to get to them as soon as I can. Alright, thank you guys.